The moment I walked through the courthouse doors in my army dress uniform, my father laughed out loud. Not a small laugh. A real one. The kind he used to save for other people's mistakes. Never mine. My sister Claire leaned toward the man beside her and said, just loud enough for the whole hallway to hear, "Look at her. Still playing soldier." I didn't answer. I didn't even turn my head. But here's something none of them knew. In exactly 40 minutes, the judge sitting behind that bench was going to look at me, and forget, just for 1 second, that he was supposed to stay neutral. My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 33, a major in the United States Army. For years, I've done work most people never hear about, helping military families through the worst days of their lives, the days a soldier doesn't come home. None of that ever mattered to my family. To them, I was the daughter who left. Claire was the one who stayed, and got praised every time, whether she earned it or not. Let me tell you how this started, because it wasn't really about money. Not at first. My grandfather was the only person in that family who never made me feel invisible. He remembered how I took my coffee. He called on my birthday even when he was sick. On his porch, he told me stories about his own years in the army, like bedtime stories instead of real history. When he died, he left a small house, some land that had been ours for 2 generations, and savings he built slowly over a lifetime. His will was simple. Split evenly between his 2 granddaughters. No confusion. Just fair. That is not what happened. While I was finishing an overseas assignment, my father quietly started moving things, accounts, property papers, through lawyers I'd never heard of. By the time I came home and started asking questions, almost everything was already in Claire's name. When I brought it up calmly, my father looked at me like I'd said something ridiculous. "You don't need the money," he said. "You've got your army paycheck." 20 years of history, erased in 1 sentence. So I did what I was trained to do. I didn't yell. I hired a lawyer and asked for the truth to be written down where a judge could see it. That's when the real fight began. My family didn't apologize. They didn't even deny it. They turned it around on me instead. They claimed I had pressured my sick grandfather into signing papers. That I had taken advantage of an old man who could no longer think clearly. They even hinted one of the signatures didn't look real, without ever saying the word out loud. I read that page twice, then set it down slowly, the way you set something down when you're afraid you might throw it across the room. They were counting on me staying quiet. Staying calm. Being the kind of daughter who never causes a scene. They just never understood what real calm looks like when you've spent your career staying steady through things far worse than a family lawsuit. So there I stood in the hallway. My father laughing. My sister rolling her eyes like I was overplaying a part. I let them have their moment. There's no point stopping people while they still think they're winning. Then the courtroom doors opened. I sat up straight, back flat, eyes forward, hands folded, the way they teach you on day 1. The judge walked in. Older, silver-haired, the kind of face that has heard every excuse a person can invent and stopped being impressed years ago. He opened his folder and scanned the room. Bored. Routine. Then his eyes reached me. And he stopped. For a second, maybe 2, he just looked at me, the way you look at an old photo you didn't expect to find. Then he cleared his throat and looked back down, like he was reminding himself where he was. Nobody else noticed. Except me. I've spent my whole career reading faces in rooms where a wrong guess could cost someone everything, and I knew exactly what I'd just seen. Recognition. Not the polite kind. The kind that catches you off guard. I didn't let it show. I kept my hands folded and let the case begin the slow, boring way cases always begin. My father looked confident. He'd hired an expensive law firm. Claire sat beside him in a blazer picked to look respectable. Their story was simple. I was the daughter who left, chasing a career instead of staying close to family, and now, conveniently, after our grandfather died, I showed up demanding money I hadn't earned. Easy to believe, if you didn't look too closely. They brought witnesses. A neighbor. A friend of Claire's who swore she once heard me say I didn't care about the old house. An accountant who spoke like he'd rehearsed his lines in a mirror. One after another, Nora wasn't around. Nora didn't help. Nora only showed up once there was money involved. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. But I understood something they didn't. The story that sounds good isn't the one that wins in a courtroom. The story with proof wins. I had spent months quietly collecting proof, while they spent months rehearsing a performance. At one point, my father turned toward the crowd. All she's ever done is put on that uniform and expect the world to feel sorry for her. A few people laughed. Claire added, without the uniform, she wouldn't have anything to hide behind. More laughter. I kept my eyes on the table and let it pass over me, the way you let weather pass over you when you're standing at attention and can't move. But the judge wasn't laughing. Every time my service record came up, his eyes lingered longer than they needed to. Once, he read a line twice, eyebrows tightening, before looking up and finding me across the room. The lawyer on the other side didn't notice. He probably told himself the judge just recognized me from somewhere. But I knew better. During a short break, I searched my memory. Nothing came clearly. Just a quiet feeling that this man had been part of my life before. When court resumed and I was called to the stand, I walked up with my spine straight, sat, was sworn in, and waited. Instead, the judge leaned forward and folded his hands. "Colonel Hayes," he said quietly. "Is he doing well?" The room went silent, the kind of silence that happens when something shifts beneath the surface. My father's lawyer glanced over, confused. Claire's face flickered with uncertainty for the first time all day. I nodded once. "He is, Your Honor." "Thank you for asking." I didn't say more. He didn't ask more. But I saw Claire lean toward our father and whisper something. For the first time since we'd walked into that courthouse, I watched my sister's confidence crack right down the middle. There's a reason that name landed the way it did. Colonel Hayes's son was a soldier I helped care for years earlier, part of the base family I served. When he was killed overseas, it was my job to walk up that driveway in dress uniform and knock on a door that had no idea what was coming. I remember the wind that day. The porch light still on, like the house hadn't caught up yet to what happened. Colonel Hayes wasn't a colonel then. Just a father in his own doorway, watching his world change all at once, then in slow waves for weeks after. My job didn't end at that doorway. I walked with them through the funeral and the paperwork neither of them could focus on. I stayed longer than I had to, answering calls at 2 a.m. when the silence became too heavy to bear. I remember his wife, months later, holding my hand and saying, "If you hadn't been there, I don't think we would have made it through those first weeks." I never knew what to say to that. You don't do that work for thanks. You do it because someone has to stay steady when everyone else has every right not to be. I never imagined he'd end up on the bench, judging my own family's case against me. But here's what matters most, recognizing me didn't change how he ran that courtroom. Not for 1 second. From that moment, his tone got even stricter. He cut off interruptions instantly. He demanded proof from every lawyer. When my father's lawyer tried to use a summary instead of the real document, the judge stopped him cold. "I don't work from summaries in a case about property and an elderly man's ability to make decisions," he said, flat and tired. "I want original documents. Bank records, not descriptions from memory. Signed papers, not typed copies. If they don't exist, I want to know why." My father's lawyer asked for a short recess to gather materials. The judge granted it without warmth and called a 15-minute break. I watched my father during that break. I recognized that tight jaw, right before he lost an argument he was sure he'd win. He leaned toward Claire and said something sharp. She nodded but didn't look at him, her eyes stuck on the folder in front of her. I sat quietly, thinking for a moment about that kitchen table years ago. A woman's hand gripping mine. A father standing in a doorway, not yet ready to understand what I'd come to tell him. I never did that work expecting it to matter here. I did it because it needed doing. But sometimes the world circles back, not to reward you, but to remind you that kindness outlasts the moment it was given in. When everyone returned, the air had changed. My father's confidence had thinned, and his legal team came back with a much thinner stack of papers. My own lawyer, a quiet, careful woman named Anna Cole, who had handled my paperwork through 3 deployments and never once raised her voice, leaned over. Now we let the documents talk. I nodded. The loudest person in the room rarely wins it. Anna presented evidence, piece by piece, the slow way of someone who'd spent months building something that couldn't be shaken loose. First, emails between my father and an estate lawyer, sent months before my grandfather even died, proving the plan to move everything into Claire's name had been discussed long in advance. Then, text messages, pulled from an old phone nobody remembered still existed, showing Claire casually talking about the transfer, the kind of careless texting people do when they never imagine a courtroom will read it back. Then, security camera footage from a small law office, showing my father, on a clearly stamped date, going over paperwork with a clerk, contradicting his sworn claim that he had nothing to do with preparing those documents. Then, bank records. Wire transfers. Account changes. A paper trail stretching further back than either of them had accounted for. I watched my father's face through all of it. It's strange, watching someone you've known your whole life try to hold a steady expression while his story quietly falls apart. He didn't crumble all at once. He crossed his arms, glanced at his lawyer, waiting for an objection that never came. Then Anna called a witness nobody expected. Walter Reed, a retired bank officer in his 70s who had managed my grandfather's accounts for over 20 years. He walked to the stand slowly, the way older men walk when something matters enough to show up for. He testified that months before my grandfather died, he had refused one of my father's account requests, worried my grandfather didn't fully understand what he was signing. My father pushed back hard, tried a different officer, and Walter reported the pressure before retiring. I didn't want to get involved in a family's business, Walter said, his voice steady despite his age. But I've thought about that day for 2 years. I couldn't just watch this happen to that man's memory without saying something. The room went completely quiet. Claire's composure, already thinning, started falling apart in pieces. First, she didn't know about the early account discussions. Then, shown her own texts, she knew but didn't understand what it meant. Then she just trusted our father and never asked questions. 3 versions of the same story, each collapsing further than the last. The judge wrote it all down without comment. Then came the moment I still think about more than any other in that trial. Anna played a voice recording, properly obtained, fully legal, pulled from a business call my father made to his accountant months earlier. A call he never thought would come back to haunt him. His voice filled the courtroom, small through the speaker but unmistakably his. "Nora's off playing soldier somewhere," the recording said. "She'll never even notice." The silence that followed wasn't the normal courtroom pause between arguments. It was the silence of an entire room recalculating, of people who had laughed at me that morning, suddenly wondering exactly what they'd been laughing at. My father stared straight ahead, refusing to look at anyone. Claire's hands were folded so tightly her knuckles turned white. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and heavier. A kind of sadness, the specific sadness of hearing, in your own father's voice, something you'd suspected but hoped, right up to the last second, wasn't true. Anna moved to a part of the case I hadn't fully realized she was building. She lifted a thick binder from her table. Inside was my full-service record, laid beside years of my own financial records, which I'd handed over months earlier without understanding how it would matter. "Your Honor," she said, "the other side has spent this trial arguing my client abandoned her family. I'd like to show the court what actually happened." What followed took almost 40 minutes. I sat there and listened to my own life read back to me in a way I'd never described it myself. Leave requests, timed around my grandfather's medical appointments, years before he even got sick. Flight records showing trips home for only 36 hours, taken while I was stationed across the world. Hospital copay receipts, dozens of them, all in my name. Property tax payments on the old house, made quietly, long before anyone imagined a fight over who owned it. Handwritten notes from my grandfather's doctor's office, thanking the granddaughter who called every month to check on his bills. I watched those documents get read into the record, one after another, and felt something strange happen in my chest. Not exactly pride, something close to it, mixed with a grief I hadn't expected to feel in a courtroom. I never kept those receipts to prove anything. I kept them because that's what you do when you're the one who shows up. I never imagined a judge would one day hold them up as proof of who I really was, instead of who my family had spent months describing me as. The detail that hit hardest was the medical payments. Because it wasn't my father's name on those receipts. It wasn't Claire's. Every single payment traced back to me, a soldier stationed thousands of miles away, sending money home, because nobody else was doing it. I watched Claire's face when that detail was read aloud. She said nothing. She stared at her hands. For the first time all day, she looked less like a woman fighting for an inheritance, and more like someone quietly realizing the story she'd told herself for years wasn't entirely true. My father sat very still. I'd seen that stillness before, usually right before he said something to end a conversation instead of continuing it. This time, nothing came. He just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes as the documents kept coming. When Anna finished, the judge took a long moment before speaking, longer than any pause all day. He looked over his glasses at my father. "Mr. Bennett, you came into my courtroom today and told a very different story than the one these documents are telling me." My father didn't answer. There wasn't really an answer to give. The judge continued, addressing the whole room now. "This court does not decide cases based on uniforms, or reputations, or who talks more confidently in a hallway. This court decides cases based on evidence. And the evidence in front of me paints a very specific picture of who provided care, and who did not." Nobody in the room laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. The same people who had chuckled at my father's joke that morning now sat in a silence that felt almost embarrassed. The final part of the trial moved fast. Truth always outpaces the story built to hide it, eventually. The judge listed the evidence for the record, the emails, bank records, security footage, Walter's testimony, Claire's shifting answers, the recorded call, all properly and legally obtained. Then he moved to my own paperwork and said it showed a clear and consistent pattern of care that directly contradicted the story my father and sister had told the court. When he reached his ruling, he read it slowly, like he wanted every word to land exactly where it needed to. The property transfers my father had arranged were completely cancelled, ruled the result of pressure and, in at least 2 cases, outright lies to banks. Ownership of the house and remaining money was restored the way my grandfather's will always intended, split evenly between Claire and me. Claire was ordered to return everything she'd taken beyond her fair share, plus the cost of the legal fight our father and sister had forced me into. My father was ordered to pay the full court costs. Then, flatly, the judge added that certain signature discrepancies would be sent to the proper authorities for further investigation. My father shot up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "This is only happening because you know her," he shouted, pointing at me. "You've had it out for me since the second you saw her name on this case." The room went still in a different way now, the stillness of people waiting to see how a judge responds to being accused of exactly the unfairness he'd spent the whole day proving he didn't have. The judge didn't raise his voice. "No," he said simply. He let that word sit in the air. "I remember your daughter, Mr. Bennett," he continued, "because years ago she helped my family through the worst day of our lives. I have never forgotten that, and I never will. But that has nothing to do with the ruling I just made." He paused, his voice gaining weight it hadn't held all day. "I ruled today on the evidence in front of me. Bank records don't care who I remember. Signatures don't care who visited my family in a hospital hallway a decade ago. I would have reached this same conclusion even if I had never met your daughter a day in my life." He looked at my father a moment longer. Something almost gentle crossed his face before it hardened back. You told this court a story today. The evidence told me a different one. I'm required to believe the evidence. Nobody said a word. My father sat back down slowly, the fight draining out of him for the first time in 33 years of watching him win every argument he ever started. Claire stared at the table, her composure gone, replaced by something that looked almost like grief, not just for the money, but for the version of the story she'd convinced herself was true. I sat still, hands folded, and let the ruling settle over me the way relief settles over a body braced for impact for far too long. The courtroom emptied slowly. I stayed in my seat a moment after the judge stepped down, wanting one quiet minute before becoming someone's daughter again, someone's sister again, out in the hallway where none of this would be settled by a ruling. My father didn't look at me on his way out. Claire lingered a moment longer. For a second, I thought she might say something, some fragment of an apology. She didn't. She just looked at me, tired in a way I'd never seen before. Then she followed our father out the door. In the weeks that followed, the family I grew up in fell apart in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms anymore. Claire was left with almost nothing close to what she once believed was hers. My father, facing court costs and the fraud investigation, ended up selling the house entirely. I want to be honest about something, because it matters more than the verdict. Nobody watching that trial walked away thinking I'd won something to celebrate. Mostly, I just felt tired and sad, the kind of sad you feel when the truth comes out, but it costs you nearly everything, including the last thread connecting you to people who used to be your whole world. I didn't gloat. I simply took back what was legally, rightfully mine. A few months later, I sold the old house. I stood in that front hallway one last time before it closed, and let myself remember my grandfather the way I wanted to, not through the lawsuit, not through my father's voice on that recording, but through smaller things. The smell of coffee on the porch mornings. His voice telling stories about his own years in uniform, stories I used to think were just bedtime tales, until I understood he had lived every word of them. With the money, I set up a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name, for kids from military families facing hard times. The kind of quiet, real help he would have wanted, far more than any courtroom win. Not revenge. Just his name attached to something that would keep helping people long after all of us were gone. I think about Colonel Hayes sometimes, too. I never reached out to him again, because I understood how important it was that his fairness that day never be mistaken for favoritism. But I've thought often about what it must have felt like, recognizing the woman who once stood in his doorway on the worst day of his life, and choosing to let the evidence speak louder than the memory. Not everyone can do that. I respect him more for it than words can say. One morning, not long after everything was settled, I put my uniform on again and drove out to my grandfather's grave. I stood there in the quiet, the way I used to stand at attention long before any of this happened, and set down a small bundle of flowers at his headstone. You used to tell me, I said quietly, that the truth always moves slower than a lie. But it gets there eventually. I stood a moment longer, then turned and walked back to my car. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was carrying anything heavy at all. Where do you think a story like this really ends? Because in real life, it doesn't always end in the courtroom. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if this story moved you even a little, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth, even when it takes its time, still finds its way home. We've got so many more stories like this one coming. So subscribe to Twisted Family Revenge Stories if you don't want to miss what's next. Let's keep this journey going.